Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. On December 3rd, 2015, husband and wife, Saeed Farouk, 28, and Tashif Mulik, 29, carried out the worst terror attack in the United States since 9/11. They killed 14 people, seriously injured at least 22 others in San Bernardino, California. This was not the first U.S.-inspired attack in the United States, nor would it be the last. On October 23, 2014, a man believed to be a self-radicalized attacked 4 police officers in New York City with a hatchet. On May 3, 2015, 2 men opened fire outside a Prophet Muhammad cartoon contest in a Dallas suburb. At least one of the gunmen appeared to have contact with ISIS operative via social media. Last month, a man was arrested in Philadelphia after shooting and wounding a police officer. The attacker claimed to have committed the attack on behalf of ISIS. In all, ISIS has conducted over 60 attacks in 20 countries. The map that is to the general's right, and I think all of you have a copy of that map. This map here. I don't know if you can see this or not. The map shows where these attacks have taken place, and they stretch from California to Australia and many places in between. The fact is the death toll from terrorism is on the rise. The chart shows global deaths from terrorism since 2001. Global deaths from terrorism are 3 times higher than when the president took office, and it's hard to say that the world is a safer place because it is not. One of the main questions of this hearing is, can these kinds of ISIS-inspired attacks be stopped? If they can't be eliminated entirely, is there more that we can be doing to make sure that there are less of these ISIS attacks? ISIS feeds on a narrative of strength. If we can puncture the narrative and show that ISIS is on the run and collapsing, that could significantly impact ISIS's ability to inspire attacks in the United States and the world. Our current strategy is not doing that, in my opinion. In the nationally televised address in September of 14, the president stated that the United States would degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. Today, 17 months later, we have not accomplished that goal. It took a year from the president's speech before he finally allowed airstrikes to target the oil infrastructure that ISIS is using to rake in millions of dollars a day. The number of strike sorties flown per day against ISIS are a quarter of what we flew in Libya in 2011, and only 2% of what we flew in Iraq in 2003. Of the sorties that did fly out, 76 returned to base without dropping any munitions. While we all know airstrikes alone can't defeat ISIS, we have yet to corral a ground force in Syria that will fight against ISIS. And the $5 million train and equip program was a failure, and the president even admits that it was a failure. The president has been unsuccessful in getting the Sunnis in Iraq to fight against ISIS, mostly because he has been equally unsuccessful in getting the Iranian-backed government in Baghdad to stop its sectarian ways. The latest round of peace talks were seen as so dismal that they were delayed until later this month, but the war rages on. Part of ISIS's strength comes from its ability to disseminate its propaganda online. Following the San Bernardino attack, it was revealed that the attackers had been communicating online where they bonded over their commitment to jihad before Mulik and was granted a visa to come into the United States. Mulik had also advocated jihad and her desire to join the fight in several private messages on social media to her friends in Pakistan. It was later discovered that at roughly the same time of the shooting, Mulik declared allegiance to ISIS on Facebook. The other main question of this hearing is what role social media is playing in the fight against ISIS. In October, ISIS issued a new instruction manual on how terrorists can use social media. Are private companies doing enough to stop this? Facebook and Twitter have both policies prohibiting the promotion of terrorism on their platforms. However, we have seen a dramatic drop-off in terrorist content on Facebook. There's still over 40,000 Twitter accounts used by ISIS supporters. What is the role the U.S. government has in all of this? The administration promised a strategy to counter online radicalization 5 years ago, but we don't have that strategy yet. I've introduced legislation requiring the strategy that passed the House unanimously in December and is currently pending in the U.S. Senate. The administration strategy leaves us with little confidence that it'll be enough to defeat ISIS. The amendment to the omnibus that was signed into law in December required the President to come up with a strategy that will actually defeat ISIS, and that strategy must be given to the American people in Congress in the summer of this year. ISIS has American blood on its hands. What are we going to do about it? And I'll now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for conducting the hearing today. I'd also like to thank our witnesses, General Keane, Ambassador Fernandez, and Dr. Swift for being here to discuss this very important topic and for their flexibility and rescheduling for today's panel. As details emerged of the December 2nd, 2015 cold-blooded attack in San Bernardino, we were left shocked and horrified by the calculation and the savagery. 14 innocent Americans died and dozens more wounded at the hands of two self-radicalized assailants. Let's keep in mind those who lost their lives, their family members, and their loved ones, again here today as we conduct this hearing. Yet while the severity of the attack caused it to resonate so strongly, we're reminded that San Bernardino was not the first attack inspired by ISIL in the United States. In fact, there have been 3 attacks in the U.S. dating back to 2014, which were carried out by individuals inspired by ISIL. It's clear that ISIL poses a threat to the United States through its ability to appeal to vulnerable demographic, predominantly young adults. As of last October, FBI Director Comey reported that his agency is pursuing over 900 active investigations against homegrown violent extremists, the majority of which are linked to ISIL. Separately, over 20,000 foreign fighters have traveled to join rebel or terrorist groups in Iraq, Syria, including ISIL. These movements are increasingly difficult to track in our globalized world, and the risk of their return to the U.S. is a great challenge to agencies overseeing foreign fighter travel. As the title of this hearing suggests, it's critical that we understand the nature of the threat posed by ISIL, be it an evolving threat, and in order to degrade and ultimately defeat a foreign terrorist organization like ISIL, we need to bring together various stakeholders such as federal, state, and local first responders and investigatory agencies and equip them with the best resources necessary to respond. To this end, I've been proud to partner with my colleague on both this committee and Homeland Security to study the threat posed by foreign fighter travel and authorize the Department of Homeland Security to develop a strategy in response, while bolstering the arsenal of fusion centers and intelligence agencies. Coordination and support for the private sector is also necessary, since many ISIL members use technology and social media platforms for communication, fundraising, and recruitment. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the threat posed by ISIL and how the United States and its partners can work together to overcome it. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Chair will yield a minute to Mr. Colonel Cook for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The promotion system was seriously flawed when I made Colonel. Don't make it any higher. Anyway, this is a very, very important hearing. Many years ago, I was part of 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, 1983. I left that when they went afloat and went into a place called Lebanon. There was a group called Hezbollah that went in there, blew up the barracks, and over 260 Marine, Army, Navy personnel were killed that day. And it always stayed in my head, and then recently in my home county that I represent, San Bernardino County, had almost deja vu all over again with, once again, Islamic terrorism. The one thing I did want to comment on, I'll talk more about knowing your enemy and everything else, was just the tremendous job that the local police department, the sheriff's office, the state, the county, everybody worked together. It was like we have a terrorist incident and they knew right away, and instead of 14 killed and I don't know how many wounded, it changes. We could have had even more. So this is an extremely important hearing. Obviously, it's right in my backyard, and I want to thank you very much for calling such an important hearing. Thank you.
Chair will yield a minute to Mr. Higgins from New York for his opening statement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think, when we're talking about terrorism, in the United States, I think it's very important to distinguish between fact and fiction. The fear-mongering that goes on in this country is extraordinary, and public polling indicates that it's very, very effective. But I think when you look at, most recent book by Peter Bergen, The United States of Jihad, who's a CNN national security analyst, wrote 4 other books on terrorism, you see that there's a real distinction between Islamic terrorists and how many people have been killed in the United States since 9/11. It's 45. Neo-Nazi and anti-government terrorists have killed over 48 people. The profile that we presume about terrorists, I think, has been shattered, at least in terms of perception. And not enough credit is given also to our counterterrorism and law enforcement efforts, be it at the fusion level, at the local level. At 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Today, there's 47,000. 1.5 million people, if they tried to get on a plane bound for the United States, would be set aside for secondary screening. So I think it's also important to recognize the effectiveness of our counterterrorism activities. And unfortunately, in counterterrorism, you never get credit for what didn't happen. And in counterterrorism, it's all about what didn't happen. So I think we should give recognition to those facts as well as we move forward with this discussion. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from New York. I'll introduce each witness and let them give their opening statements. General Jack Keane is a retired 4-star general, former Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, and currently serves as chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. Ambassador Alberto Fernandez is Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute. Ambassador Fernandez served as a U.S. Foreign Service officer and as the State Department's coordinator for the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. And we also have Dr. Christopher Swift, is an adjunct professor of national security studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Dr. Swift has conducted extensive research on terrorism, armed conflict, and the intersection between international law and national security. General Keane, we'll start with you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the committee, for inviting me back today to talk about such an important subject. I'm honored to be here on the panel with my distinguished colleagues. Please refer to the map that we provided by the Institute of the Study of War, which I will reference in my remarks. The primary objective of the United States government remains protecting the homeland and the American people, including safeguarding American values both in the homeland and abroad. The San Bernardino attack following the Paris attacks, the downing of the Russian airliner, and multiple attacks by ISIS in Lebanon and Turkey all once again dramatically emphasized the danger and vulnerability of civilian population to terrorism. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, in his recent report to the Congress stated that homegrown extremists pose the most significant threat to the United States homeland in 2016. While I believe this is a daunting task to prevent all such attacks, I am confident in the United States law enforcement and intelligence capabilities to rise to the challenge. Having the best defensive security system in America is not sufficient. We must have as good an offense to stop and defeat ISIS, which is where I will concentrate my remarks. While the United States offensive capability is there, the strategy is not. Indeed, without an effective strategy, we are destined to prolong the barbarism and the killing in the region while driving up the risk at home. Radical Islam is morphing into a global jihad with the expansion of al-Qaeda and extraordinary success of ISIS, which has rapidly become the most successful terrorist organization in modern history. ISIS has 3 major goals. The first is to defend Syria and Iraq. While ISIS has lost some territory, it views operations in Syria and Iraq as largely successful because it still controls large swaths of territory, it's recruiting well, 1,500 to 2,000 per month, it's maintaining initiative, and it's able to logistically sustain its forces. The second goal is to use its headquarters in Syria to expand in what ISIS terms the near abroad. It's in orange on your map with black or blue stars by establishing affiliate organizations with a formal relationship in 9 countries and regions, with 3 in the blue about to be formed. ISIS provides guidance and resources to most of these affiliates. The third major goal is to influence the far abroad. On your map, see areas in yellow, which are Muslim lands and countries that are supporting the coalition against ISIS, the United States, Europe, and Australia, to name some. ISIS does so by inspiring, motivating, or directing followers to kill their fellow citizens, by averaging thousands of social media posts per day, and by returning fighters from Syria who are trained and motivated to attack their own citizens at home. ISIS attempts to divide and polarize these societies by weakening the people's resolve to support their government's effort, and to fragment and polarize the non-Muslim and Muslim populations. What can be done? First, defeat the idea. National leaders and Muslim clerics must undermine the political and religious ideology with not just what is wrong, but what is right. The battle is within Islam itself, where in the Arab world this battle is intersecting with authoritarian regimes and family monarchies' failure to politically reform and to adjust to the needs of their societies. Therefore, we are fighting a political and religious ideology which draws its origin from the very strict interpretation of the Quran and Hadith, as well as the intolerance of Wahhabism and Salafism. Political leaders such as al-Sisi and King Abdullah have referred to it as a religious revolution. Yet U.S. policy fails to define radical Islam or explain it nor understand it. How can we possibly defeat radical Islam if we don't understand it? Knowing the kind of war you are fighting is the first priority of a national or military leader. We must challenge ISIS not simply in mosques and schools and other gathering places, op-eds and the like, but also certainly on the internet. Second, destroy the safe havens. No insurgency was ever defeated where a safe haven existed. The major lesson of 9/11 was that the al-Qaeda safe haven was allowed to exist in Afghanistan for many years, even after the al-Qaeda successfully attacked the U.S. Embassy in Africa and the USS Cole. The longer terrorists are allowed safe haven, history advises the terrorists become more experienced, more lethal, and more ambitious. Iraq, and particularly Syria, are ISIS safe havens. Recognize that the current strategy of relying on local defense forces without sufficient numbers, arms, training, and not maximizing effective air power protracts the war against ISIS for years, unnecessarily. In my judgment, throw out strategic patience and replace it with strategic urgency to defeat ISIS. While the military effort in Iraq and Syria is significantly under-resourced, the political effort, which is so necessary to achieve a military victory, is also flawed. I'd be willing to take that on in Q&A. Third, marginalize the affiliates. The 9/11 Commission recommended a global alliance to defeat radical Islam. In parallel with destroying ISIS safe havens in Iraq and Syria, partnering with allies to marginalize or, where possible, defeat affiliates is critical. Otherwise, ISIS will reemerge at an affiliate location, now likely Libya. The U.S. is beginning an effort in Libya against ISIS. Sharing intelligence, technology, equipment, and training is a proven winner in harnessing the collective resources of an alliance in defeating a common enemy. In conclusion, ISIS and al-Qaeda pose the most imminent threat to the security and values of the United States and Europe. The success of these radical Islamist military organizations comes only partly from their own strength and will. It results also from a general collapse of the international order, driven partly by the withdrawal of the United States from supporting that order, partly by the irresponsible passivity and free riding of most European states, partly by the unrealized expectations of the people of the Middle East, and partly from the active attempts of Iran, China, and Russia to dismantle all or part of a global order designed to favor our values and interests and to replace it with one that favors theirs. Understanding what is happening and why is the basic ingredient to developing achievable strategies. The United States is facing global security challenges on a scale not seen since the rise of the Soviet Union post-World War II. While complex and difficult, it is certainly not hopeless, and the world has never needed American leadership more than it does today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Keane. Ambassador Fernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee, for having me today. It's great to be back again. Measured in comparison with most other terrorist groups and insurgent movements, the ISIS brand is a major success. The fact that it has mobilized tens of thousands to flee their countries, thousands of them leaving very comfortable circumstances in the West, is testimony to the enduring power of its message. It most certainly does represent a revolutionary contemporary appeal. This is not going back to the Middle Ages. But despite being so new, its success now is that it is not a specific video or statement or act that mobilizes, but rather the concept, the image of the organization. This is an idea and a symbol which has matured and been internalized by those people that support it. That's one of the lessons of San Bernardino and other places. One result of these attacks is to make the Islamic State look even more ubiquitous, powerful, and conquering than it actually is. It is something that we see in the West, including in the government and media, sometimes unwittingly helping to suggest that they are actually more powerful than they are. They're actually quite extraordinary, but we make them look even more than they are. While the actual state in its Syrian, Iraqi heartland is slowly, all too slowly, weakening, the virtual caliphate, the idea of the state, its image, its sense, remains relatively intact and powerful. The ISIS victory narrative has been sustained to this day by two elements: the actions and growth of the ISIS franchises and these continued attacks in the West, such as Paris, which mimic and in a way replace the preferred image of ISIS of military victory on the ground. They would rather be marching into Baghdad and Damascus, but in lieu of that, they'll take what they can get, whether in San Bernardino or Paris or Sinai or wherever. This image can still be sustained for a while, especially if the continued progress against ISIS on the ground remains slow and gradual. As long as the idea of the ISIS Khilafah remains plausible, it will continue to attract recruits, spawn terrorist operations, focusing on targets of opportunity worldwide, and spin-off copycat operations. You cannot contain the ISIS brand if the ISIS caliphate is merely contained. So you see the seeming paradox. The best way to weaken the ISIS brand is to crush it in the field militarily. But the more you push, the greater the incentive they will have to lash out in both planned operations and encourage zealous young devotees to act. That's the price we're going to have to pay. Success in planned operations will no doubt lead to attempts by lone wolves in the future. So obviously, ISIS needs to lose, and even more importantly, to be seen to lose. In addition to military progress, powerfully and graphically portrayed, technical means used by both social media companies and government need to shrink the size of the online state. But while those two things are important, the core message of the ISIS brand also needs to be answered. Some of this work is beginning, albeit all too slowly and weakly. Given the importance of Iraq and especially Syria in the ISIS discourse and how it is sold to Westerners and even to people in the Middle East distant from the front, there is real value in empowering Syrian and Iraqi Sunni Muslim voices who can speak directly to wavering individuals outside the Middle East. This hasn't been done yet. The voices of recanters and defectors need to be raised much higher than they have been. Governments receiving returnees from ISIS ranks should find creative ways to incentivize counter-radicalization media outreach as much as integration and law enforcement. And we actually have a great template because we have ISIS's own way of producing these personal testimony videos. There should also be room for a well-funded effort promoting tolerant, liberal Arab Muslim values in contradistinction to the vision of Salafi jihadism. ISIS is a really important phenomenon, but it's part of a much wider phenomenon occurring. Government should also look to empower and expand the scope of non-governmental messaging platforms and organizations within the Middle East with the goal towards building sustainable messaging efforts against Salafi jihadism. It's not something that only the US government or friendly governments can do. So the ISIS brand or way of doing things has now metastasized and been internalized, but it can at least be chipped away by a combination of military, technical, and counter-messaging efforts. I am concerned that steps have been too little and too late so far, but I see that we're slowly beginning to move in the right direction, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Fernandez. Dr. Swift.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, honorable members, it is a pleasure to be here before you today and to be with my esteemed colleagues. I agree with General Keane that the first step in any war is to know your adversary and to know the nature of the war you are embarking upon, not changing it to or turning it into something alien to its own nature. And I agree with Ambassador Fernandez that ISIS has a remarkable tendency to amplify its own importance and influence through messaging and narrative. But at the same time, we have to see the messaging as a symptom of the disease and understand the disease in its own context. And so what I'd like to do with my statement today is provide you with a framework for understanding how individualized action contributes to and aggregates global jihad. And so what I'd like to do is start with a discussion of two major shifts in the global Salafi jihadi movement, and then put them into a practical context in terms of what we're seeing with ISIS-inspired attacks, not just in the United States, but also in Western Europe. There are two major trends in the Salafi jihadi movement today. The first is the localization of global jihad, and the second is the atomization of global jihad. These two things are distinct but complementary. This is how they work. Localization is a product of a generational shift in leadership from the individuals who started al-Qaeda and fought the Soviet Union in Afghanistan to the deputies that survived al-Qaeda's failures and fought against the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq. We see this generational shift, and we see with it a geographic shift in the focus of the Salafi jihadi movement from the cultural and geographic periphery of the Islamic world to the Sunni Arab core. In fact, if you look at the map provided by the Institute for the Study of War, you can see the drawing into the Sunni Arab core as a fundamental part of this localization strategy. Now, what does localization do? Well, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Salafi jihadi groups are fighting in Arab countries with a Sunni majority, where they speak the language, recognize the local tribal structure, and can build roots, something that al-Qaeda was never able to do. This is why the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula initially, in Yemen, and now ISIS in Syria and Iraq, has become the true base that al-Qaeda never was able to become. It has a population, it has a way of generating resources, it has a way of deploying and organizing manpower, money, and materiel. At the same time, we see the atomization of global jihad, and that is to say, violence undertaken by individuals who have a desire to become part of a broader imagined community. We see this in the attacks that we've experienced in the United States over the space of the last 2 decades. We see it in the messaging that Ambassador Fernandez was discussing earlier, and we see it in the tragic events of San Bernardino. How is this different? Well, unlike the localization of global jihad, it doesn't build on organizations. It builds on ideas. And so where the localization of global jihad creates a political caliphate, a political community that provides a foundation. As Ambassador Fernandez noted, the atomization of global jihad thrives on an imagined caliphate, an imagined community. If you look at the thing that distinguishes ISIS from every single transnational terrorist syndicate in the world today, it is the combination of this political community that has a foundation in real places and real people, and this imagined community that exists online. What are the consequences strategically? Well, they're twofold. The first is ISIS can organize, recruit, and direct violent force to serve its ends. It uses direct action in the places where it has direct access. But ISIS can also recruit, inspire, and direct indirect action through social media, through print media, and through broadcast media. And that allows them to operate in our strategic depth without the need to commit their regular forces. There are three implications for that, honorable members, and they are as follows. The first is we need to understand that ISIS is opportunistic. It uses different tools in different theaters depending on what its capabilities are in those places. Chairman Poe, if you look at the map you presented earlier, the number of direct ISIS attacks in Europe is substantially higher, while the number of ISIS-inspired attacks in the United States is substantially higher. That breakdown is not surprising at all. Europe has closer proximity to the Syrian civil war. It's in the middle of a major refugee crisis, and they have large, alienated domestic Muslim populations that are not well integrated into European society. Contrast that with the United States, where we have a much more diffuse Muslim population. We are not proximate to a major conflict, and we are not experiencing a major refugee crisis. The tools that ISIS uses here to influence, disrupt, and intimidate are much more tools of facilitation and resonant effects, inspiring people online or engaging and recruiting them through online chat rooms, through Skype, and through other sorts of mediated or facilitated dialogues. So for the United States, the risk of terrorist infiltration is somewhat lower than it is compared to our European allies, but the risk of the homegrown radical, of the individual we're not able to identify early on, is much, much higher, in part because that's the strategy ISIS is using here versus the strategy of infiltration that we've seen them use in Paris and elsewhere. This is why the trends we are seeing look so different, even though the underlying motives and ideology and psychology are the same. Honorable members, I'd like to conclude with one last thought before we get to question and answer, and that is that success in one theater does not necessarily create security in another. And here's what I mean by that. Terrorism is a low-risk, high-return strategy that weaker organizations use to reach beyond their grasp and punch above their weight. Organizations use terrorism when they are not able to confront and defeat their adversary directly. So the more we contain, degrade, isolate ISIS in the Middle East, the more effective our strategy becomes in places like Iraq and Syria. And I agree with General Keane that we do need a more effective approach. The more likely it is that ISIS will lash out using indirect effects, using unconventional means in Western Europe and the United States. Success in one area does not necessarily yield security in the other, and if we're going to turn up the temperature on ISIS in the Middle East, we should anticipate, plan, and prepare for, on a whole-of-government basis, more terrorism here at home. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. It was excellent. I'll yield 5 minutes to myself for some questions and get your answers. I agree with you, Dr. Swift, that this is a multifaceted issue. We need a strategy to combat ISIS, but not just in the United States, or not just in Syria, not just in North Africa, but online and all of the other avenues where we see ISIS creeping its ugly head up. And we need a strategy for all of the above, not just for one area. General Keane, there's been some talk about, and I see your map, and it's very disturbing. I got all of North Africa under somewhat of an influence in areas of ISIS. What's the situation with ISIS's rumored movement toward Libya and moving their headquarters, if I can use that word, to Libya? Explain to us what's taking place here.
Well, first of all, it's much more than a rumor. It is a fact. They've been putting fighters and resources into Libya for over a year now. And certainly the social and political upheaval that's taken place in the Middle East is known to the committee members and certainly everybody at this table that radical Islamist groups take advantage of those events. And Libya is by definition a failed state, and don't want to revisit why that happened, but it is, and they're taking huge advantage of that. I mean, conservative estimates are somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 are now there, and other estimates are as high as 10. I'm skeptical about the higher number, but I don't have access to top secret information. But they have several thousand in there, and they intend to expand it. They have put their own leaders on the ground there to assist with training and also with equipping, and I'm confident they'll be providing guidance to them. Certainly, they can be predators in terms of what's taking place in Africa itself. They have a movement already in the Sinai challenging Egypt and El-Sisi, and certainly they can influence that from Libya. They can also influence Tunisia. But most significantly, I think the thing that concerns most of us is the access it would give them to Europe, because they're a small body of water away from influencing Europe and bringing terrorism there. So it's a potentially dangerous situation. I think the United States here is doing absolutely the right thing by recognizing that we just cannot take away the safe havens, which we're doing, as I indicated, not with the sense of urgency I think it needs, that we have to look at these affiliates as well, prioritize them in what are the most dangerous, and work with partners as much as we can to deal with this. This should not be the burden of the United States military exclusively, when we have so many people in the region who are concerned about this threat as much as we are. And that's why I believe that partnering is essential to do this. But I do believe our special operations are on this. I think the CIA has been collecting on this for some time. And there's also al-Qaeda groups in Libya that are dangerous as well. So that's, I think, where we are. We'll make some progress against some of these groups, but I think until we partner with others in the region to take a more holistic approach to it, it won't be nearly as effective as we can be.
Two more questions. I would like for you to define the enemy, more than just a name. I mean, they've been called ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, and all types of different names. But how would you define the enemy?
I mean, they're clearly a radical Islamist organization that's grounded in a political and theological ideology. They base it on a very strict interpretation of the Quran and Hadith, and they have huge geopolitical objectives in terms of not only dominating Muslim lands, but also in terms of ISIS, stimulating an apocalyptic event in Europe, which would carve out a rather large caliphate for them, with also eventually seeking world domination. They're somewhat similar to the al-Qaeda in that respect, but the methodology that they go about achieving it are somewhat different. And so I think ISIS, in that terms, is the best way to describe it. And I agree with the ambassador of how they've been able to achieve success in what they're doing as well.
My time has expired. I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thought I had when we're talking about our coalition, we can all get up and sign on together, take pictures together, issue statements together. But one of the things that really doesn't line up, and I think it's critical, is the hierarchy of interest in terms of ISIL with our coalition. Now, let's set Europe aside as a separate example. I'm going around the Mideast region and the Northern African region, and who among our coalition has ISIL ranked number 1 as their concern? Turkey, I think it's number 3 or 4. Saudi Arabia, it's not number 1 in my opinion. So we're lining up with this coalition, but that's our primary concern right now in terms of our own. Name another country in the other region outside of our European allies that ranks at number one. Can you?
I think in the Middle East, the country I believe that puts ISIS ahead of the Iranian influence in the Middle East. Most all these other countries Sunni Arab countries consider Iran the greatest threat, and I agree with that assessment. But Egypt would put it number one.
Any other thoughts on that? The imperfect coalition.
Ranking Member Keating, I would say that Russia probably puts ISIS number one for the purposes of propaganda, but not for the purposes of operations. And to the extent that ISIS is a threat, it is a threat to a proxy rather than a threat to Russia's own interests.
Ambassador?
I would just add, sir, that obviously Iraq would put it as number one, not out of any special devotion to eliminate ISIS, but because it obviously represents an immediate national security threat. The problem with Iraq, seeing it that way, is it sees it within the lens of the problem of sectarianism within Iraq, and the only problems of the Iraqi government itself it has with its own Sunni Arab population.
Just make another observation. When I look at the map, General, King Abdullah met with a group of us not long ago, and he said, here's the battlefront. He had 17 points, but they almost juxtapose over your regions as well. I mean, that is it's important to defeat ISIL, to take away their territory, obviously, but we can't lose that perspective that this map presents and what King Abdullah said as well. I mean, that's also our front line, and it's spread all over the place. Isn't that an important perspective?
I agree. I mean, I have another map that shows the influence of Iran and put it in red, the countries they're dominating, in green, essentially Sunni Arab countries. Most of the Middle East countries look at that map and take that as their largest threat. I mean, what I was trying to say at the end of my remarks is that certainly ISIS exists and is succeeding, but it's part of a larger story that's taking place in the Middle East with the collapse of the order that's there, and also a much larger geopolitical story where Iran, Russia, and China are also pushing back on international orders, which has some impacts. I don't think you can look at these threats in isolation, I believe is what you're suggesting.
Yes.
I would agree with that, Congressman Keating. But nonetheless, as you're working with these threats, it does take some intellectual muscle to determine how best to meet these challenges.
This is a great topic and so expansive, but let me just jump to something more recent. The siege on Aleppo, how's that going to change the landscape going forward? Are some of the people, they're pretty tough choices, the people in that area. There's the Assad government, and then the Syrian rebels are now taking a very important hit here. And what about the influence of al-Nusra in this?
Sir, if I could add, I think that's a really important question, and it goes to what General Keane just said. ISIS is the most prominent part of a larger phenomenon of radical Sunni Arab revivalism. But ISIS's success has also done something else. It's ignited a political, ideological, military arms race among the Al-Qaeda franchises. You know, when ISIS rose and Al-Qaeda was kind of dumbfounded, Al-Qaeda Central was these old men in Waziristan. But the franchises have learned, they've adapted, some better and some worse. The Nusra Front has been in the forefront of being smart, creative, and planning really, really well. Obviously, and by the way, the fall of Aleppo, one thing that, of course, it does is it discredits the West, it discredits the United States, and it simplifies things both for the two worst actors remaining standing, the Assad regime on the one hand and ISIS on the other. So that's actually good for them and it's bad for us.
It's a terrible choice. Just quickly, Dr. Swift.
Ranking Member Keating, I wanted to go back and point out a broader issue about the map. I think when we look at this particular map, we have to distinguish between ISIS's ambitions and their operations, and then we need to distinguish between their operations and their traction. Traction requires building roots in a society, knowing where the bodies are buried, how to raise money, who the stakeholders are, who the political players are, what tribes to interface with. And if you look at what some of the most successful al-Qaeda successor organizations have done, they've really built themselves into whatever the local political, social, and economic framework was in a particular place. That's the localization of global jihad that makes it possible for these organizations to do things that al-Qaeda and other transnational terrorist syndicates were never able to do. When we're looking at where ISIS is going and what it can do, we really need to be looking at how far it's dug into the societies where it's operating versus the light touch or the ambition we see in their messaging, and break that down very consistently.
Thank you. You know, I'm going to yield back. My time is over, but I hope that thread can be picked up by other members' questions, because that is very important. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And I understand, by the way, a great hearing and everything, but why San Bernardino? I mean, in terms of the impact on it, it just seems, I could understand a military base, I can understand a hospital, but going into a county building and killing 14 people, they're certainly going to have all of San Bernardino County and the city, probably 99% of them, they might have been neutral on some of these issues, but now to do that, and particularly in an area where we've had some success where the different agencies have worked together as opposed to other state cities where it was very disjointed. And as I said, I thought the police response was good, even though 14 died. I think it could have been in the hundreds if it was a different objective. And could you just comment on that? And,
Well, I think all the three of us can do is speculate, but the yes, there are certainly more vulnerable targets, greater targets for them to access. There has to be some relationship. You know, the fact that Farouk was an employee there, and had I would suspect the relationship there was in the equation in making that decision. Familiarity is another, but certainly there are other targets that could have had a significantly greater impact. Thank God. And also, I think we all know also, because the police and the FBI reported that they did intend to kill more people with the bombs that they had, but fortunately they did not go off.
Generally, I agree with you. And you had made a comment about intelligence. And I'm not sure if I have a warm and fuzzy feeling. I understand national intelligence and everything else, but some of these things, getting down to local agencies in terms of, and any threat assessment is real iffy. But if I'm somebody down there in the San Bernardino Police Department or the Sheriff's Department, I'm interested if there's a threat on a terrorist activity, whether it's radical Islam, neo-Nazi, you name it, whether we could take action. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions on that?
Well, you're moving out of my expertise, but in dealing with law enforcement leaders, I mean, clearly the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as many of our major cities, have very good intelligence systems. I think when you get beyond some of that, and I believe that's what you're talking about, then there are issues there, certainly. And every time I've had a problem like this in the United States military, what I've always thrown at that problem is training and education, and usually has a payoff. So we have the expertise, and we've got to get that expertise out to others, and certainly there's no lack of motivation, and how you build effective intelligence systems and what the cues are, et cetera. And I think we can do that.
Are you okay with the, do you think it gets down to that level, or do we need to do that? Because my experience sometimes is, you know, it's classified, can't talk to you about this, or it's too compartmentalized, and I don't know whether that would solve the problem or at least give them a warning, because it's going to happen again someplace. You know, we've had it in Boston, some other place, and I'm just wondering whether we've got to do that.
Well, I mean, it shouldn't surprise us when you get beyond major urban centers where they have the resources to be able to put together actually intelligent systems. Obviously, New York's the most notable, that smaller sheriff's departments are not going to have that resource. But also what they have is human intelligence because they're on the ground out there. And I think the awareness that we're trying to build in this country, when you see something, say something, and work through the issues, that the FBI has reported out that 80% of the school shootings and terrorist activities that have taken place in our country, the shooters have spoken to somebody about what they were going to do before they executed the act. So that means there is intelligence out there. Now, whether we can educate the public enough so that peers, family members, those in the circle of relationships are willing to come forward is another issue.
Dr. Swift, you were going to comment real quick.
Representative Cook, I've had the pleasure of working in fusion centers when I was doing financial intelligence at the Treasury Department, and also the pleasure of advising joint terrorism task forces on some of these issues. There are two questions you asked, sir. The first, why San Bernardino? And the second, what can we do about it? So the answer to the first question is the adversary picks the fight. They pick the weapon, and they pick the terrain. And when you're dealing with inspired violence as opposed to directed violence, the terrain is going to be where the person who is inspired and self-motivated happens to find themselves. The weapon is going to be what they can acquire in that place, and the target is going to be whoever they think is the most appropriate target given those circumstances. So when we're dealing with a self-radicalization phenomenon as opposed to something that's directed, it could be anywhere, because what matters is not the direction that a command and control system is providing, but what exists in the mind of the person who's creating the act.
Yeah, I got to yield back. They're giving me that evil eye.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was a hearing earlier today in Foreign Affairs where it was disclosed that in the past year, ISIS has had their footprint reduced in both Iraq and Syria. Iraq, it was 40%. Syria, it was 10%, with excessive airstrikes led by the United States. But what's, I think, most disturbing, and I think General Keane, you had alluded to it, is ISIS's introduction to the African continent. And there is a lot of instability to exploit in the African continent. There's 55 countries, the newest of which is South Sudan. There are more failed states in that continent than anywhere else. And as you also made reference to, its close proximity to Europe. And, you know, when you look at the United States, I think we have done, again, law enforcement and others have done a good job in integrating the Arab Muslim community. It's not the case in most European countries. In fact, Muslims make up about 10% of the French population, but they represent about 70% of the prison population. That is a disaffected group. That is a group that is ripe for radicalization. So just if you could elaborate a little bit further on your concerns about, you know, the African continent and the ISIS presence in Libya, I think that would be very helpful to us.
Thank you. Well, clearly, by the way, ISW produces this map, but this is ISIS map. This is their graphics, not ours. And clearly they are interested in North Africa, and they're putting resources into it. I believe part of that is Egypt, and part of that is also Europe. I believe they're going to continue to put those resources in there unless we counter them. And remember, when they go into Europe, they are very sensitive to what you just suggested, that there are Muslim communities in Europe that are not assimilated. And they really want to foment the Muslim and non-Muslim divide. They want to take advantage of it. That is the apocalyptic event that they're describing. They bring Europe, in their minds, this is their goal, to a a calamitous war based on that divide. And one of the things that we must do in our own country and also in Europe is not overreact to this threat. What I mean by that is over-policing, taking away people's civil liberties, creating a sense of alienation in communities. We got to be careful about how we deal with this. So when the French president stands up and he's proud of the fact that he's conducted 800 raids into Muslim communities, well, on the surface of that sounds like a good thing. But I'm willing to speculate that most of those raids did not yield much of anything, and yet he's busting down doors where kids are living and families are living and the rest of it. And we have the scars of this ourselves in the United States military, is because we were doing that in the beginning when we were dealing with Al-Qaeda and the Sunni insurgency in Iraq.
Thank the gentleman from New York. Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
This hearing's title focuses us on ISIS. There is also the Shiite alliance headed by Tehran, including Hezbollah, Assad, and many of the forces in the Baghdad government. And I believe that Shiite alliance is more dangerous. I think, General Keane, you agreed with that. They have killed more Americans, starting with our Marines in Beirut, and including those they killed with IEDs given to the Taliban and given to forces fighting against us in Iraq. And just the Assad wing of that alliance, and I should mention the alliance also includes the Houthi in Yemen, but just the Assad wing has killed perhaps 200,000 innocent Sunnis. So they've killed more Arab civilians, they've killed more Americans. But I think the chief difference is when ISIS kills 50 people, they put it on YouTube. When Assad murders 1,000 civilians, he has the good taste to deny it. And so, of course, we're focused on ISIS as being the enemy and the great evil. Twitter has announced that they're going after sites that are being used to recruit. They used to do a much worse job than Facebook. They're now apparently getting better. Gentlemen, I don't know if you've had enough time because it's been a recent announcement, but do any of you have an opinion on whether Facebook and especially Twitter is doing a good job in interrupting terrorist recruitment? Ambassador?
Yes, sir. This is something that both when I was in the government and now at the Middle East Media Research Institute, we study very closely. Facebook has actually led in efforts to clean up the platforms that it has. So it's really been a leader. We've seen that over the past year in kind of policing itself rather well. Twitter was the happy hunting ground of ISIS a year ago. I remember in government, it was basically a completely unpoliced state. They have taken these steps very recently. It's not the solution, but it's a very large step in the right direction, and they're to be applauded for that.
So if Facebook has done a great job, what phrase today's Twitter deserves?
I'd give them a C+.
Okay. I'm going to move to the topic we dealt with at the full committee, and that is defeating ISIS where it is, because the existence of a caliphate, even if one that shrunk, is an inspiration to demented minds in Paris, San Bernardino, and elsewhere. General, In World War II, we carried out a serious strategic bombing campaign. And I was told by the French ambassador we killed 90,000 French civilians in occupied Europe. And yet we were greeted as liberators when we arrived. Yet our approach to strategic efforts against ISIS's economics is very and war building capacity is very different. For example, in the testimony today, the administration did not disagree with the decision of the Iraqi government to provide free electricity to Mosul and other areas controlled by ISIS. I don't remember us trying to provide free electricity, fuel, or food to occupied Europe during World War II. There's also, up until recently, ISIS has been paying persons who are who live in ISIS area and are subject to their taxation. I don't remember Charles de Gaulle parachuting banknotes into occupied France in order to pay people working for the government there. And then, of course, we've had the zero, we heard the testimony today, then when it comes to hitting their tanker trucks, which allow them to sell petroleum, we're only willing to bomb the tanker trucks if we find them parked with the drivers away. We are not willing to hit the tanker trucks while they're moving because that would kill the driver or might endanger the driver. What language would we be speaking here today if during World War II we had not hit any Nazi train or truck unless it was parked?
Well, I know. I mean, you're frustrated with that, the absurdity of all of it. Look at it. We live in literally different times, and our values have shifted. Roosevelt and Churchill made a decision, as you well know, that it was not enough to defeat the German army and the Nazi military force. They believed they had to defeat the German people so it would not give rise to this kind of behavior for a third time in Europe. So we ran continuous bombing campaigns against major German cities that had no military value.
If I can,
put that aside.
That's not. I'm talking about our bombing of occupied Europe, where we were hitting strategically useful economic targets in occupied France.
When we bombed targets in Europe, certainly we went after their war industry, and certainly most of the people who were working in their war industry were in fact civilians, and it is an absurdity that we would not take down ISIS's economic infrastructure, even though civilians are working in it. That's number one. Number two, and you alluded to it, the bombing campaign is different. I mean, even though I am very critical of this campaign because the rules of engagement is what you just described in military terms are overly restrictive. The president made a policy decision. He wanted 0 civilian casualties. He was told that's very unrealistic, even though we have the most sophisticated precision-guided munitions and the most sophisticated system to protect the loss of civilian life. When you're fighting a war in and among civilians, civilian deaths are not avoidable. All that said, we go out of our way to avoid civilian casualties, but the bombing campaign still is not what it should be. Now, when people tell you that in the Gulf War in '91 or in the Gulf War in 2003 or in Afghanistan, we did thousands and thousands of attacks a day. Remember what we were doing. We were going after a nation-state's infrastructure, which is largely a physical-based system that supports a nation-state. In going after ISIS, most of those structures that they're using, they have civilians in those structures with us, and we know that. So we've been unwilling to go after that. That is why I have been a proponent for a long time of conducting large-scale special operation forces raids, usually probably using Rangers to do it, surprise attacks to take down these physical plants that ISIS is occupying and doing its business, all the things that we described that a safe haven does. Some risk involved in that, that's direct combat. We've got the skill sets to do this, and we could truly start to handicap this organization in a way that air power cannot.
Well, I thank all three of you for being here. Very informative, very fascinating, and the committee members may have some more questions for you, and they'll put those in writing and send them to you, and then we'll expect some answers quickly. So the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you very much.